Hello, everyone. Welcome to week number 6 in Bio 120. Another week of genetics, which is awesome because I love that, and I hope you do too. But let's see what we've got going on. I went too far. Okay, last week we learned about DNA. We learned about transcription and translation, which are the ways that DNA actually is used to produce proteins. Let me move my face over. Proteins, and most of those proteins are enzymes in cells, and enzymes run all the biochemistry in cells. So the enzymes that are needed to do all the chemistry to make the cell whatever its identity is contained in that DNA. Mitosis is the way the cells split. We learned about the cell cycle. We learned about cancer, oncogenes, proto-oncogenes, tumor suppressor genes, and how genes relate to the cell cycle. So we had lots of good discussion last week. I think every one of us has been touched by cancer in some way or another, so it was a very pertinent topic for last week. All right, this week is more about DNA and inheritance, which is awesome. I love this stuff, just saying. So the chapters this week, 11 is about meiosis, and that's the production of sex cells like sperm and eggs. Skim chapter 12, which is about inheritance. We don't have a lot this week for your assignments that has to do with inheritance patterns, but you do if you're taking the lab with this lecture. Yeah, you have a lot of that this week. Both of these are in Unit 3. And then Chapter 47, which is, I believe it's in the last unit in the textbook, and it's about biodiversity. And biodiversity just means that you've got to have variety in every level of organization in the universe, really. You have to have diversity in genes in a population. Everybody can't have the same genes, because if you do, then there's no way for adaptation to happen when different environmental factors come along, including diseases, etc. You've got to have biodiversity in different species in an ecosystem. You have to have biodiversity just across the whole world, because different organisms are going to survive in different environments. Everything from the deepest parts of the ocean where we can't survive to in polar ice caps. Yes, there are organisms that survive in ice. To hot springs in Yellowstone National Park, to the swamps, to the ocean, to soil microbes, to us. Yeah, we have to have biodiversity in every realm in our biosphere on the planet. Read through Module 6, the Module 6 overview. It contains some information that you're not going to need, but you will if you are taking the lab. Anyway, watch the videos on meiosis, but especially the one on epigenetics, and it's very, very important. I'm going to talk about epigenetics in just a minute. All right, this week, what do you have to do? Hi, hippopotamus. This week, discussion board postings. First of all, about epigenetics and that video that you watched, and especially the experiment that they did with the identical mice that look completely different, and the way that they discuss what happens in even identical twins as they age. So this is a very interesting week this week. It may open your eyes to other things that are happening with genetics than what you thought. And we're going to have a discussion of nature versus nurture. I'm sure you've heard of this before. So is your identity as an organism based on the genes that produce you, that produce the cells in you? Or is it influenced by the environment? And that's the nurture part of this. Do your experiences produce who you are? And of course, the answer is both. Both are very important. And so we're going to take a look at that this week. Your journal entry is all about how bacteria reproduce and asexual and sexual reproduction, but I'm going to give you a hint right here. Look in chapter 22, section 2. That is all about how bacteria reproduce and how they get new genetic information, because that's part of your essay too. If bacteria just split in half by binary fission, one mother cell makes identical daughter cells, then how in the world does variation come about? Well, there are all different kinds of ways the bacteria do this because they don't do sexual reproduction. But they have ways to even mutate their own DNA to cause changes in their DNA to help them survive. So take a look at that this week. You're going to discuss asexual versus sexual reproduction and advantages and drawbacks of each. If you're a bacterium and you asexually reproduce, all you have to do is split in half. You do not have to look for a mate. You do not have to sit around and wait for somebody to text you back to see if you can hang out this Friday night. Nope. That's not how bacteria roll. So, advantages and disadvantages of each. You're going to be exploring that. Biodiversity. Along with that, you need a definition of evolution, because evolution is really important in biodiversity. It has to happen. So what is evolution? A change in genes in a population over time. Sometimes those changes are huge to the point where new species are produced. Sometimes they are tiny little changes that seem to have no effect. And then, boom, all of a sudden, they do have an effect because they allow you to be resistant to a particular disease that comes along. So, evolution, change in genes in a population over time. Simple definition, but very powerful. And you're going to discuss genetic erosion in agriculture because we are losing so many species of food animals and food crops, etc. A lot of us are moving back toward heirloom varieties, and there are things like seed banks that help us save varieties of tomatoes, etc., that we grew a long time ago that these huge farming operations don't grow anymore because the tomatoes are softer and they are harder to transport and they don't last very long in grocery stores. But there are ways that we can continue these varieties, and especially in home gardens, that sort of thing. And also this week, you will have graded the 3 milestones for your final project. I will be grading the week 5 assignments, but I've already graded the first 2 milestones in week 3 and week 4. So you need to gather all of that information together and start making your slides for your final project. Your final project will consist of slides, a slide presentation with graphics, with photos, with statistics, with data, with cartoons. There are all kinds of ways that you can help amp up the visual effects of slides. You will be working on your slides this week, and you'll be working on your slides next week, and turn those in by the end of week 7. Okay? Take a look at the instructions and get started on that. Make sure you look at my feedback and fix what you need to fix and revise what you need to revise so that you have a very, very good final project. And I will tell you why. The final project counts 260 points out of 1,000 total points. That is more than 1/4 of your total grade is that final project. But you will have had every part of it graded so far. You know what I'm looking for. You know how to do the revisions. And then you just put together a really good slideshow. So work on your slides on week 6. They're not due till week 7, but go ahead and get started with that. So now for a little bit of the content, let me mention a couple of things so we have all the same information. Genes equal traits. So what is a gene? A gene is a little piece of DNA. A little piece of DNA that codes for something. The DNA codes for a trait. Usually it is an enzyme that is used in a particular pathway. And if you're missing that enzyme, then you won't produce this trait. So genes equal traits. I've given you 3 examples here of some genetic conditions that we know about, and we know about a lot of them, and we're finding more every day. But albinism is the first picture, and it's a lack of melanin production in melanocytes in individuals, and this is a recessive trait. And you know what that means. You know that it means it's hidden unless you have 2 copies of it. The one in the middle is Marfan disease or syndrome. This is where people grow very, very tall. A lot of basketball players and volleyball players have been shown to have Marfan syndrome because they get very, very tall. They have big feet, big hands. They also have some medical conditions. Usually they have terrible problems with their backs. Terrible problems. And they can also have a split in their aorta, which is the main artery that comes out of the heart, with absolutely no warning. And this happens to people with Marfan syndrome. So be aware of that. That is a dominant trait. And then on the right there, you have sickle cell anemia, and these red blood cells are sickling out. You see the red blood cell in the middle that looks sort of like a Werther's lozenge or candy. You see that one? The little oval shaped one with the dip in the middle. That's what a red blood cell is supposed to look like. All those little pointed ones, they have sickled out and they get caught in capillaries. So when you have sickle cell anemia, when you have 2 copies of the sickle cell trait, your cells can sickle out like this under low oxygen conditions, and then the red blood cells get caught in your capillaries, and you can't deliver oxygen to those tissues. And that means that the tissues can die or can be harmed at least. And so you don't want that to happen if you have sickle cell anemia. But that is what sickle cell anemia looks like when you look at your blood. That's also a recessive trait. You have to have 2 copies of the trait in order to show the disease. All right, epigenetics, I wanted to touch on this because this is an important part of the work this week. Epigenetics means over and above the genes, something above, beyond the genes. So genes determine the traits that you have. But every cell in our bodies, with some exceptions, but every cell in our body, for the most part, has exactly the same DNA. Then why does one cell become a liver cell, and one cell become a red blood cell, and another cell become a brain cell, another cell become a nerve cell, another cell become a muscle cell, another cell become a cell in small intestine? Why do we have all these identities, but we have exactly the same DNA in all of our cells? That's because certain genes are turned on or turned off in different cells. That's epigenetics. Epigenetics decides when the genes are expressed and when they're not expressed. That's also important. So what does this mean if we can understand more about epigenetics? I've always said that the human genome was absolutely a wonderful thing that we figured out back in the 1990s. We figured out the base sequence of DNA in humans, which was amazing. This was back when computers were rudimentary, and it was very difficult to do. It took a lot of time, and a lot of scientists from all over the world helped to figure out the base sequence of human DNA. I thought that was wonderful, but always in the back of my mind I said, that's all well and good, but we got to figure out how to turn on and off genes. And then we came across epigenetics, and we have discovered lots of things about these mechanisms. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze. Sorry. We've discovered a lot about turning on and off genes. And just think of the things that we could do if we could understand this perfectly. We could turn off disease genes. We could turn on genes to repair or to cause cells to divide. If your heart muscle cells are damaged by a heart attack. There's no repair of that. When nerves, a lot of the time, when nerves are destroyed or damaged in some way, you cannot get those back, right? What if we could control cancer cells by turning off the genes that make them divide? We could solve so many problems and cure so many diseases and conditions if we completely understood epigenetics, and we are moving in that direction. So in the future, this will happen. We will be able to do this. We're understanding more and more about epigenetics every day, but it's a tremendously important part of genetics now. Oops. All right. I'm going to find the clicker. There we go. You're also going to discuss nature versus nurture, and I explained what that was. Nature, are you determined by your DNA? Does that tell you who you are? Or does your environment shape who you are? It's any kind of organism, not just human beings, but any kind of organism. And of course, the answer is going to be both, because we know that environmental conditions, exposure to things in the environment, from toxins to pollutants to trauma, can determine who you are. Are your genes important? Of course they are. We also know that there are genes that we inherit from our family members that could make us susceptible to diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, and high blood pressure, and all sorts of things. So you know that the answer is both. This is a very interesting area of study, and there's been a lot of interest in this for centuries, actually. Not just decades, but centuries. And horrible ideas have come about because of this. We need to destroy a whole race of human beings because we think that they are inferior. Yeah, we've had some trouble with that in our history, haven't we? That's a reason that you study history. If you want to understand what this topic was like back in the mid-1900s, in the very best year of the mid-1900s, 1956, the year that I was born. Yep, soon I'll be 70. Whew! But in 1956, a little movie came out called The Bad Seed. You can watch it. Here I got a link to YouTube where you can watch The Bad Seed. And it really gives you an idea of how people were looking at this nature versus nurture topic, even way back then. And it was even before that. But way back then, way before we even understood DNA and environmental exposures and all that sort of thing. I mean, I hate to tell you this, but when I was looking through photos the other day, I saw a picture of my mother, way big pregnant with me, and she was just smoking away. And she had always told me that she quit smoking when she was pregnant with me. I have photographic evidence of something different. So anyway, yeah, that was back before people really understood the effects of taking drugs while you were pregnant and smoking and drinking and all, all the rest of it. So watch this movie. It is fascinating and terrifying, but as in the way of the 1950s in movies, you have to have a happy ending. Happy, yeah, it depends on your definition. But anyway, watch it. It is a great watch. So I'm just saying, that goes through that nature versus nurture issue in this movie. What is wrong with my PowerPoint? There you go. Also, I wanted to include the importance of sexual reproduction. The importance of sexual reproduction is that you get mixing of genes, even between two of the same parents. And the reason that I'm showing you the Duggar family here, everybody knows who they are. So anyway, you have the Duggar family here, and every one of these kids is different from the other ones, even though the two parents are the same. They got, 19 kids? And they're all different from each other. Why is that? because of the mixing of the genes from the mother and the father. The mother has the potential to make 8 million different varieties of eggs. The father has the potential to make 8 million different variations in his sperm cells based on the way the chromosomes line up during meiosis. And therefore, you get lots of variety in the offspring. That is the whole point of sexual reproduction. You want this variety. And why is that? Because no matter what kind of environmental stressor, no matter what type of disease comes along, no matter what type of horrific weather thing happens, whatever it is, you're hoping that at least one of your offspring will survive. And that's why you need that variety. So that's the importance of sexual reproduction. Even though it takes time to find a mate, and it takes energy. And if you think about it, the mother is putting her genetics on the line by the mate that she chooses, because females usually choose the mates. Not always, but usually. So she's putting her genetics on the line by sharing her genetics with a mate. And so there are issues with that, right? If you don't pick the right person, if you don't pick the right mate, if you're a frog. Yeah. So sexual reproduction is important, but it has its drawbacks too. And that's one thing that you'll discuss this week. All right, let's see if I can get to the next slide. I'm having trouble today. Biodiversity. I mentioned this. We need biodiversity as far as genes go, as far as species go, as far as populations go, ecosystems, and all the organisms on the planet. We've got to have biodiversity to fill the different niches in ecosystems and to have enough variety so that some of the organisms will survive, even if there are stressors in the ecosystem, even if there is selection pressure against some of the organisms in the ecosystem. So biodiversity is extremely important. And this has to do with genetics too. Very important. All right, if you're having any issues this week, if you're stumped on what you need to do for this final project, please just email me at m.sigmon@snhu.edu. I am here for you. I am here to help you. We're in our last weeks now, so let's move it forward and get her done. All right. Have a great week number 6.